Welcome back. This is the third module of the Freshwell Low Carb Lifestyle Program. It's a joint enterprise with the practices of the Colne Valley Primary Care Network. You're stuck with me again, Dr. David Oliver from Freshwell Health Centre in Finchingfield. Just to run through the disclaimer again, this is information, not medical advice, and it's important that you speak with your doctor or nurse before starting a low carb program if you suffer from any health conditions, particularly if you've got on medication for type 2 diabetes or high blood pressure. You can monitor these conditions at home with a home blood pressure monitor or a blood glucose monitor, and it may well be that you'll end up having to reduce your medication on a low carb diet, and that's why it's so important to liaise with your own medical team. We appreciate that we've asked you to take a bit of a leap of faith. We're living in a world where you're told to minimize your saturated fat intake and told to eat plenty of starchy whole grain bread, etc. And we're advising you the complete opposite. In Module 3, Shopping Low Carb in a High Carb World, we're going to talk a little bit more about fat and shopping low carb. Just to go over those things again. Minimize processed food, minimize sugar, whether it's table sugar or hidden sugar, minimize starchy carbohydrate intake, eat real food, try to prioritize protein, which will fill you up, and don't worry too much about eating natural fat. So moving on to the types of fat that there are, there's saturated fat, which occurs naturally. You find it in meat, eggs, dairy, and coconut oil. Unsaturated fat, you have monounsaturated fats, which are generally regarded by everyone to be good for you, found in oily fish, olive oil, coconut oil. Polyunsaturated fats, other vegetable oils, examples would include rapeseed oil, corn oil, sunflower oil, and then trans fats, which you may have heard are extremely bad for you, which are industrialized, modified, unsaturated oils which turn solid at room temperature. They are still found in some foods, but they are heavily restricted. Many of the polyunsaturated fats, such as rapeseed oil, are highly processed. You take your rapeseed from the field and you clean it, you grind it, you press it, add a solvent, extract the oil, add alkali, centrifuge it, add water, centrifuge it, remove soapy water, bleach, and deodorize it, and then you have your lovely bottle of oil. Just seems wrong, really, to be processing a food so highly, and it's our opinion that this type of oil is not very good for you at all. There's been a widespread general world belief for the last 60 years that fat, in particular saturated fat, is bad for you, and this mainly stemmed from a research paper by a researcher called Ansel Keys, and the paper was called the 7 Countries Study in 1958. Large numbers of people, several countries, and he compared the average amount of fat intake per person in that country versus the number of deaths from heart disease in that country. And his hypothesis was that consuming fat increases the blood cholesterol, leading to heart disease. To this day, people tend to talk about saturated fat clogging arteries, and they seem to liken a kitchen sink where you pour fat down, and then the pipes get filled up with fat, and they seem to make a direct comparison with the narrowing of the arteries that you see in heart disease. And really, we think this is oversimplistic and just wrong. So when you look at the graph that Ansel Keys plotted, you can see what appears initially to be quite an impressive straight line relationship. So you've got Japan with lower fat intake and low amount of heart disease deaths, versus the USA at the top of the graph, where there is a high amount of fat intake and a high amount of heart disease. But Ansel Keys actually studied 22 countries, and actually if you look at the plots here, it's very much harder to plot a straight line through that, and the relationship between dietary fat and heart disease, when you look at that graph, is much more questionable. Medical school, we used to learn about the French paradox and why the French used to eat so much saturated fat and but not have the heart disease to go with it. It makes a lot more sense now. Another experiment was set up in 1968 to prove once and for all that saturated fat clogs arteries and thereby causes heart disease. This was a double-blind randomized controlled trial, which is a very carefully controlled trial, and the subjects were 9,500 psychiatric inpatients in psychiatric hospitals, and half of them were given a high saturated fat diet and the other half were given a high vegetable oil diet. It went on for 5 years, and as far as I can work out, they weren't given much of a choice, and I don't think this sort of experiment would get ethical approval these days for those reasons. Really, the hypothesis was that eating vegetable oil, not saturated fat, would reduce your heart disease and by lowering your cholesterol. Interestingly, it was shown that vegetable oil did indeed decrease the total cholesterol, but it actually increased the risk of heart disease and death. Now, if you recall from last week, we were talking about the different types of cholesterol, and we're talking about total cholesterol here, which we don't think is a very good indicator. You really need to know more information about the types of cholesterol, but they didn't have that at the time. But the overall message here is that saturated fat would appear better for you than polyunsaturated fat. They didn't like these results and they were buried because they were disappointing and they never came to be published at that time. Turns out that Ansel Keys, who did the 7-country study, was one of the authors, and this old research was dug up by a researcher and was published in the British Medical Journal in 2016. Another trial that was set up in 1993 involved a huge number of patients, which was about 50,000 women. It was an 8-year trial, and they split the patients into a low-fat versus a normal diet group, and the outcomes were that there was no difference in rates of heart attacks, stroke and cancer, and there was no difference in weight gain or weight loss. In 2019, just last year, there was a huge study, meta-analysis, where they looked at lots and lots of different studies on saturated fats versus other fats, and they really concluded that there was no reason to continue the current recommendations of restricting saturated fats. So we live in a world where we're told that saturated fat is bad for us. The fact that starchy carbohydrates turn to sugar doesn't seem to be a problem for the authors of the dietary guidelines, so we need to bear this in mind when we're looking at food labels. They developed the traffic light system for the front of packets, where green is good and red is bad. There's no labeling information on the amount of carbohydrates on the front of the packet. We need to count total carbohydrates and not just sugar. And as we've just been discussing, fat and saturated fat, in our opinion, is not bad for you. Hopefully from last week you'll record the experiment which somebody did comparing how the blood sugar is affected by wheat biscuit cereal compared to full-fat Greek yogurt, homemade granola and raspberries. And we could see that the wheat biscuit cereal caused really quite a spike in the blood sugar. In fact, it wasn't that dissimilar to having a donut. As we can see below, the label on the wheat biscuit cereal is all green. So according to that label system, it should be all good for us. But if you look at the side of the box, you get some more useful information. You'll find that 2 wheat biscuits here, 35 grams, weigh 35 grams each, and 29 grams of those is carbohydrate. I don't know about you, but when I used to eat these, I used to eat at least 4 at a time. There's also milk, there's also carbs in the milk, and also most people sprinkle quite a bit of sugar on top. And really, that's quite a big chunk of carbs to start the day. You'll be hungry by lunchtime. And really, we suggest aiming for less than 130 grams of carbs a day, or lower if you can. And really, this is quite heavily eaten into that allowance. There can be potentially huge amounts of carbohydrates in some breakfast cereals, especially the sweet ones. This is a well-known brand and shows that there is 82 grams per 100 grams of carbohydrates, of which 35 grams are sugar. When we suggest people look at labels, we think it's best if you can get your carbohydrate content of whatever that is down to less than 10 grams of carbohydrates per 100 grams, then that is a good rule of thumb. Clearly, according to this particular cereal is really quite harmful to your health. It's also easy to get tricked by food manufacturers about portion sizes. On the front of a packet, you'll often see images with an overflowing bowl of cereal. They give portion sizes as 30 grams of cereal, which is a ludicrously small amount. That second picture is 30 grams of cereal. I would suspect that most people would have at least 4 to 5 times that amount. So many natural healthy fats that are great for low carb diets look bad using the traffic light system. There is one thing that low carb community and high carb community perhaps agree on, and that's that oily fish are good for you, quite high in monounsaturated fats. On this packet of mackerel, however, we can see 2 red warning labels warning us that this product is high in fat and high in saturated fat. So looking at the front of that label, you may choose to avoid it, but that would be a shame because mackerel is an excellent healthy food. Again, looking at this cheese, same goes really. It's been labelled as unhealthy, but when you're eating low carb, then you're allowed to have fat and saturated fat, both which have got a red warning label there. On the other hand, this traffic light system can make many processed foods look much more healthy than it is. In this case, you can see there's a whole string of greens which would naturally make you think that this thing is a good thing to eat or drink. These labels are referring to a can of diet soft drink, which is really water with a load of chemicals in it. So this is another example of how food labeling can be deceptive. Here's a loaf of ultra-processed bread. Looking at the traffic light system, this doesn't look too bad. But if you have a closer look at the ingredient label on the back, you will see a long list of ingredients, many of which are chemicals that we have no idea what they are, and this bread is not going to do you any good, and you need to steer well clear of a label that looks like this. Processed food manufacturers will try all sorts of marketing gimmicks and health claims to try to draw you into buying their junk. They might say on the front of the packet that it's high in fibre, there's added vitamins, no artificial colours or preservatives, source of calcium, heart healthy, lowers your cholesterol. Really, just try not to be drawn in by this kind of thing. Really, they are not interested in your health. They just want to make a profit. Also watch out for words like no added sugar and sugar-free. This usually means that the food hasn't had extra added sugar as an ingredient. food that has no added sugar may still taste sweet and contain sugar. No added sugar doesn't mean to say it has a low sugar content, and the food may contain other ingredients that have a natural sweetener, such as dates, honey, fruit. So other sneaky tricks which are pulled on us by the food industry. They will tell us all sorts of things. They will say this has got no calories or sugar, only natural flavors, no added preservatives, GMO free, gluten free, allergen free, suitable for vegetarians and vegans. And all of those descriptions are descriptions of a can of Diet Cola. And if you look at the ingredients there, it's just a bunch of chemicals with water, and that just isn't good for you. A little bit more information about the side or the back of the labeling. As I said before, they can quote carbohydrate content per 100 grams, and that can be a little bit more useful in trying to work out how much carb there is in something. If you can find something that has got less than 10 grams of carbs per 100 grams, then that's a low carb option and worth considering. Also, again, taking into account the serving size, this serving size here next to the 100 grams, each slice typically contains 44 grams. That is 20 grams per slice of bread, and but are you really having one, which works out as 20 grams of carbs, or two slices, which is 40 grams of carbs? Another good tip when you're looking at labels of ingredients, the ingredients are listed in order, so that the first few ingredients are the main ones in the product, and towards the end of the list these ingredients are used in smaller amounts. So if the first few ingredients are high carb items like sugar, flour, vegetable oils, you really need to be avoiding that product if possible. So generally, the fewer number of ingredients, the less processed the food, and that is a good thing to go on. If you want to compare natural butter, which yes has saturated fat, but we know that is fine, versus a supposedly healthy margarine, you've got in this pack of butter, you've basically got cream and salt, and that's your lot. In this packet of supposedly healthy margarine, you have got a long list of ingredients and chemicals, and you will see that this particular margarine is apparently proven to lower your cholesterol. We know now that it's a little bit more complicated than that, and lowering total cholesterol didn't seem to help those patients we were talking about in the Minnesota experiment whose cholesterol went down and their incidence of heart disease went up. As we said in the last module and this module, that it's not about the total cholesterol. That's too simplistic. You really need to be looking at the different types of cholesterol, the HDL, the LDL, and what the total cholesterol HDL ratio is. So we are highly skeptical about this kind of product. I was quite interested to learn recently that there are at least 56 different names for sugar. So when you're looking down a food label and you don't understand what something is, it may well be sugar. We have the simple sugars, such as these ones you may recognize from previous modules, glucose and fructose, for example. And then you've got other granulated sugars, all these ones, and more granulated sugars, all these ones, and some liquid sugars, these ones, and these ones. And it almost seems like somebody's trying to hide the fact that there's sugar in their product. So looking at more food labels, you can see that these particular labels have got lots of different types of sugar in it, and it just gets buried. Nobody really understands. It's a bit like looking at the terms and conditions when you download something. Just a quick word on sweetness, really. The general gist of low carb is to try to reduce sweet tasting food once you minimize your intake of sweet tasting food, you crave it less, and it becomes easier. And what you do find is that you become much more aware of sweet tastes. One thing I've found is that I used to not really be able to tolerate high percentage cocoa chocolate. So, for example, 70% cocoa chocolate was about the best that I could manage, but now I find that pretty sweet, and I'm quite happy with a 90% chocolate. And you find that things, your taste for sweet stuff does change if you can minimize your intake of it. So one of the problems is of sweetness is it doesn't stop you craving sweet food, and it's sort of easier to minimize it so that you don't have those cravings and temptations to eat sugar. And when it's hidden in processed food, it's best avoided, really. If you're going to use sugar, xylitol seems one of the less harmless one, unless you're a dog. It's quite poisonous to dogs, so if you've got a dog in the house, then you may not want to take that risk. Erythritol is another sweetener which seems pretty harmless and seems to taste fine. And but if you can avoid using sweeteners, so much the better. Use them as a treat, but not every day, ideally. So a few top tips for going shopping. These probably sound a little bit obvious, but worth mentioning. When you're hungry, probably not a good idea to go shopping. You may buy some stuff that you wouldn't otherwise. If a packet's got a long ingredient list, as we've discovered, it's ultra processed, probably got some hidden sugars in there, and best avoided. When you go around the supermarket, you tend to find yourself walking straight into the vegetable aisle, and then you go around the edge, and there's the meat section, the fish section, and perhaps the dairy section, and then in the middle you've got all the processed food. And it's quite interesting to go around the supermarket and just have a look and just see how much ultra processed food there is in supermarkets, and often it's in the middle. And if you go around the outside, then often that's where the unprocessed food is. Obviously there's no one size fits all there. And yeah, make a shopping list. That's the hard bit, but it makes a big difference when you're planning to cook low carb. So the sort of things that you may wish to buy when you're shopping low carb: above ground vegetables, fish, eggs, meat, seafood, full fat dairy. Try to avoid the low fat stuff that has generally got more sugar in it. Pulse is a good medium carb option, but obviously good for people who eat less meat. Plenty of protein in there. Fruit, again, we've said in the past, berries are quite low in carbohydrate and sugar, and so tart fruit like grapefruit and lemons are okay too. Other natural fats, coconut oil is quite good for frying in, if you don't mind the taste of coconut. Avocado oil is a little bit more expensive, or avocados themselves are, they're considered very sort of healthy food. Other extras that you might want to snack on: Brazil nuts, almonds, walnuts, and even a couple of squares of chocolate if the percentage of cocoa is high enough, 70% plus. The lower the percentage, the higher amount of sugar there is, so you need to be a little bit careful with anything that's less than 70% cocoa. And in the Freshwell Meal Planner, which is available on our website, there is all sorts of advice in there about planning and cooking low carb. So if you haven't seen that, that is definitely well worth a look. Well done, you've made it to the end of the third module, halfway through the course. Next week we're going to be talking about time-restricted eating and intermittent fasting, which is not so much about what you eat than when you eat. So thanks very much for your attention, and we look forward to welcoming you to Module 4.